Over the next 10 minutes or so, I want to introduce you to three people that have had a profound impact on my life and my career. None of them are aware of this impact, and none of them know each other. And I'd be willing to guess that you all have similar influences, and if you're lucky, you've had the same influence on other people. Before we get to that, I want to give you a little bit of a backdrop on myself. I've spent my whole career in healthcare, 20 years in rehabilitation. Rehabilitation world is an interesting world. We have the opportunity to work with patients after they've had a significant event that has changed their ability to return home, to return to work. I'm sure that any number of us in this room know someone that has had a car accident or a heart surgery or a stroke that required rehab. It's a physically demanding space to work. It's inspiring and rewarding, but demanding. This is not a talk about healthcare. It's not a talk about rehab. What it is a talk about is identifying those people that have had an impact on you, using that knowledge to build a platform to inspire others. So the first person I want to talk about today is my Uncle Gord. Uncle Gord was my hero growing up. He was an amazing athlete in high school. He played football, rugby, a whole bunch of other things. After high school, he picked up wrestling, and 2 years later, he was in the Olympics. 2 years after that, the World Championships. He later switched and went back to school and got a PhD in sports psychology and switched to coaching. He later coached the Canadian national team. He was pretty awesome. I was mesmerized by him, but it wasn't for these reasons. The reasons he impacted me was because he had the ability to talk to you and make you feel like you were the only person there. He had the ability to give you that individualized attention that made you feel like there were simply outstanding, amazing accomplishments just waiting for you to seek them out. Gord wasn't with us very long. He was diagnosed with ALS at the age of 39, and at 43 he died. His impact is carried with me every day since then. So Gordy had a tough haul in the healthcare system, and I learned from that experience that he had. I learned from his influence on me. And to this day, even though it's been 30 years since I've heard his voice, there is still a steady, very tangible trickle-down effect of the words that he taught me and how we interact with our patients. So in rehab, again, going back to rehab, we get a long period of time to work with patients. We get to see them for weeks, if not months, and that allows us the opportunity to establish a relationship with the patient, to establish a treatment plan that is specifically focused on their needs, and not just their physical needs, but maybe their situational needs. Does this patient have 2 flights of stairs that they have to get up at home to get to their bedroom? Do they need to be able to navigate different types of surfaces at work? Do they like to golf and they need to work on their hand-eye coordination and their balance in order to get back on the course? The patient, in that sense, inspires the rehab. The question we always ask is, can the rehab inspire the patient? Can it inspire the family? Can it inspire the team? So the next person that I want to talk about is my son. My son Smith is a pretty normal, average kid. Hard to say he's normal, but he is average. He loves sports and video games and wrestling with his brothers, and he sort of likes science and he sort of hates math, and his room is a disaster. One Christmas, Smitty came to us with his Christmas list, and it had 4 or 5 items on the list. The top item on the list was the standout item, and it didn't make any sense to us at that time. Smitty had asked for a brand new pair of tap shoes. This was a kid that had never taken a dance class before. He had never shown any interest. He had probably seen tap dancing 1 or 2 times on TV. But it was clear that this was what was important to him. Now, as a young and potentially misguided father, I tried to convince him that maybe this wasn't what he wanted. Maybe he really wanted a video game. But it became clear very quickly that this was the gift that Smitty wanted. So you can imagine his happiness on Christmas morning when he opened up his box, and there was tap shoes and a bow tie and a top hat and a cane. And we could have given him something else. We could have forced our feelings onto him, but we wouldn't have had that 15 seconds of perfection when he donned his tap shoes and did a dance on our kitchen floor. It struck me after that our patients aren't any different than Smitty. They all have needs. They all have desires. They all have things that are important to them. They may be off of our radar as healthcare providers. They may seem frivolous, but they're important to them, and they all have tap shoes. We encourage our staff to find their patients' tap shoes, and it's not always going to be delivered on a Christmas list, but it is something that if you can find it, you can dramatically impact a patient, a customer, a friend. So a couple weeks after that Christmas, we had a patient in our hospital who had had a highly successful stay. He had been there about 2 weeks, was preparing to go home, return to work. And about 2 days before, we realized we had a problem. He was unhappy. We didn't know what the issue was, but what the issue was he wanted a can of Sprite. We didn't have any Sprite. He didn't want a can of 7-Up. He didn't want a can of Coke. He wanted a cold can of Sprite. So as administrators, this was off our radar as something that was important to the patient. It took a very intuitive, smart therapist to identify that this wasn't a can of Sprite. This was his tap shoes. And she took the initiative to go out, buy the can of Sprite, satisfy the patient, and not only was he happy, but he was moved and touched by the personal, individualized attention that he received. Again, not a topic on healthcare. Healthcare is not important. It's just where I happen to work. We all have tap shoes. You all have tap shoes at one time or another. Your friends do, your coworkers do, your customers do, your loved ones do. They all have tap shoes. It's our job to find those tap shoes and to respond to them. Brings me to my next influence. If there's any New Orleans Saints fans in the building, you know what this is. This is Steve Gleason. Steve Gleason was a college football player at Washington State University. He was undrafted out of college and went on to have a very successful 8-year career with the New Orleans Saints. He was not the biggest, nor the strongest, nor the fastest guy on the field. He just worked. And he went on to make probably the most impactful play in the history of the franchise. This is 2006, the first game back in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And he blocked a kick that went on to win an improbable game and forever drive them into the hearts of Saints fans everywhere, including myself. There's a statue of him outside of a stadium. Come on. So Steve was a worker. He had a work ethic, and it was what drew me to him was his work ethic, and I loved to watch him play. But it wasn't until after he retired that he really became my hero. So at the age of 34, when Steve was 34, and 3 years after retirement, he too was diagnosed with ALS, same disease that took my uncle. Very quickly after that, he and his wife formed a foundation called Team Gleason, and the foundation has 2 branches, and one of the branches is to take ALS patients and other patients with neuromuscular diseases on adventure trips around the world. One year, they planned to go to Machu Picchu, and it was a team of 8 with Steve, another gentleman who had ALS, and they were going to make the climb up Machu Picchu. You can imagine the effort that this took to take 2 grown men, their wheelchairs, their associated gear, and carry them up to the target site 8,000 feet above sea level. It's amazing. It's crazy. But what was really amazing to me was what happened the day before they started the hike. They arrived in Peru, and they're in a small town in the middle of Peru, and they're planning to go out to dinner. They're traveling down the ancient, very bumpy cobblestone street. And Steve, in his wheelchair, as is common with ALS patients, he had a loss of body function control, and he had an accident. And this man, who is perpetually positive, was miserable. And he looked to his wife, and through his communication device, he said to her, "I'm questioning God. He has either cursed me or he is absent." They know that this is going to be a miserable evening, but they push on and they go to dinner. And they're in this restaurant in very remote Peru, and a woman walks up to Michelle with tears streaming down her face, holding her phone up. And on the phone is a picture from the day before where she completed the Machu Picchu hike. And because of the influence of Steve on her, she chose to wear a Team Gleason t-shirt as she finished the hike. She had no knowledge that they would be there. There was no way that they would ever expect to cross paths. But because of his influence and his inspiration, she was able to overcome her fear of heights to make this climb. Every time I see this, it gets me. Every time I talk about it, it gets me. And it crushes me by the beauty of it. And it reminds me that our influence is far-reaching. We never know when something we're doing will impact somebody on the other side of the room. We never know that handshake that you give or that eye contact that you give will impact a patient's recovery. The ability to go into a patient's room and shake their hand and address them by their name might be what they need to return to their home. There's a quote by T.E. Lawrence that really summarizes what these three men and a boy, mean to me and their influence on my career. "All men dream, but not equally. Those who dream by night in the dusty recesses of their mind wake in the day to find that it was vanity. But the dreamers of the day are dangerous men, for they may act their dream with open eyes to make it possible." I encourage everybody in this room to find the tap shoes of the people around you, to be dreamers of the day and act upon those dreams to make great things happen. Thank you very much.